The radio operator at Forward Operating Base Kilo didn't hesitate. He looked at the blinking signal on his screen, an American pilot alive wounded, broadcasting from inside enemy territory, and he reached over and switched it off. Not because of a malfunction, not because of interference. He turned it off on purpose. Then he turned to his superior and said 4 words that would haunt an entire unit for years. "Command says let her." And just like that, Captain Emily Carter was erased from the mission board. Before we go any further, if stories like this move you, stories about courage, sacrifice, and the people who refuse to leave others behind, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss one. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. Captain Emily Carter had a ritual before every mission. She would sit alone for exactly 3 minutes. Not praying, not reviewing maps, not running through contingencies. Just sitting, breathing, letting the silence settle around her like armor. Some of the younger soldiers thought it was strange. The older ones, the ones who had been doing this long enough to understand what silence meant, they never interrupted her. On the morning of October 14th, Emily sat in that silence for 4 minutes instead of 3. She didn't know why. She couldn't have explained it, but something in the air felt different, and her body registered it before her mind had the chance to. She was 27 years old. She had completed 11 combat deployments. She had carried wounded soldiers off of burning vehicles while rounds were still coming in. She had administered battlefield medicine in conditions that would have broken most medical professionals with twice her training. She had been decorated 4 times, reprimanded twice both times for going back when orders said to stay. That detail matters. It matters more than anything else about her record. Because Emily Carter's greatest flaw, if you could call it that, was also the thing that kept people alive. She could not accept loss when she still had breath in her body to prevent it. It wasn't recklessness. It wasn't arrogance. It was something quieter and far more dangerous, a bone-deep conviction that the person next to her was worth whatever it cost. Her commanding officer, Major Gerald Simmons, once told her in a closed-door meeting, "Carter, your problem is that you believe everyone is worth saving." She had looked at him evenly and said, "With respect, sir, I think that's your problem too. You just haven't admitted it yet." Simmons had no response for that. He wrote her up anyway. The mission on October 14th was classified. What can be said is this: it was a reconnaissance insertion into a mountainous region of eastern Afghanistan, an area where 3 separate enemy factions had been operating with increasing coordination. Intelligence suggested a high-value communication node was operating from a series of ridgelines that American surveillance assets couldn't fully cover from the air. The mission required boots in that terrain, human eyes at close range, gathering what no satellite could. Emily's team was not supposed to be the tip of the spear. They were part of the support layer, a combat rescue element attached to the insertion package, in case the primary reconnaissance unit needed emergency medical extraction. Her Black Hawk helicopter call sign Echo 21 was flying the outer perimeter of the valley when everything came apart. She heard the impact before she felt it, a sound like the world tearing itself in half, then heat, then nothing, then pain. She came back to consciousness with her cheek pressed against cold rock and her left arm bent at an angle that told her without needing to look that something in it was broken. Not cracked, broken. She could feel the way the bone had shifted, the nauseating wrongness of it, the way her body was already shutting down sensation in that limb as a kind of mercy. She lay still for exactly 4 seconds. That was her training. Never move immediately. Assess first. The helicopter was behind her. She could hear it burning without turning around. The sound was low and consistent, not an explosion waiting to happen, just wreckage consuming itself. She registered that, filed it away. It meant she had time, but not much. She could hear her own breathing. Ragged but present. She could feel both legs. Her right was functional. Her left had taken damage somewhere below the knee. She could feel a deep, grinding ache that suggested a fracture, but when she pressed carefully against the boot leather, the bone held. Damaged, not destroyed, she turned her head slowly and looked at what was left of Echo 21. The helicopter had come down hard against the ridgeline on its starboard side, skidding 30 meters before the fuselage split against a cluster of boulders. The cockpit was completely destroyed. She knew without checking what that meant for the pilots. She had seen enough crashes to read wreckage the way other people read words on a page. She made herself look at the cargo compartment. She made herself count. Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb, Specialist David Okafor, Corporal Tommy Reyes, her people. She made herself look at each of them for 1 full second each. Then she made herself look away. She had a rule she had developed over 11 deployments and more close calls than she could count on one hand. She had never written it down. She had never said it out loud to anyone. But it was the rule that had kept her functional in moments when falling apart would have been the easier and perhaps more human choice. The rule was this: grieve when you're safe, never before. She would carry Webb and Okafor and Reyes inside her for the rest of her life. She knew that already, but right now carrying them inside her would have to be enough. Because there were enemy fighters moving along the ridgeline above the crash site, and if she didn't move in the next 2 minutes, carrying was not something she was going to be doing for very long. She got to her feet. The pain from her left leg nearly took her back down. She caught herself on a piece of fuselage wreckage, held on, breathed through it the way she'd been trained, the way you breathe through something that would otherwise break you slowly, deliberately treating air like currency you can't afford to waste. Then she began to move. Her first priority was the med kit from the crash, and she found it wedged under a section of collapsed frame, scorched on one side but intact. She opened it one-handed, working with practiced economy. Field dressings, pressure bandage for her arm. The kind of care that wasn't going to heal her, that was never the point in this moment. The point was function. Keep the arm immobile, keep the leg moving, stay conscious, stay quiet. Her radio was the next problem. The primary unit was destroyed. She found it in 3 pieces near the cockpit and didn't waste time on it. But the personal emergency transmitter on her vest, the one that was supposed to broadcast a locator signal, automatically on impact, it was damaged. Not destroyed, but damaged. The locator function was gone. The voice transmission was intermittent, cycling in and out in a pattern she couldn't predict or control. She keyed the transmitter anyway. This is Echo 2-1. Kilo flight down. Crew status critical. 1 survivor, ambulatory 2-4 kilometers east of primary insertion zone. Request immediate extraction. She released the key. Static, only static. She tried again on 3 different frequencies, working through the band, methodically, the way you do when you know the answer might be no, but you make yourself ask every question before you accept silence as the final word. Nothing. Echo 2-1, any station, request emergency relay. Single survivor grid follows. She gave the grid. She gave it twice. The static didn't change. Above her on the ridgeline, she could hear voices now. She didn't need to understand the language to understand the tone. Sharp directional men fanning out across terrain, they knew intimately. They were searching the crash site. They would reach her position in less than 10 minutes. She closed the med kit, secured it to her vest, checked the condition of her sidearm. Her rifle had been destroyed in the crash and began moving up the slope away from the wreckage. She did not look back. What Emily did not know, could not have known, was what was happening 32 miles away at Forward Operating Base Kilo as she pulled herself up that mountain with a broken arm and a fractured leg. The emergency transmitter had worked. Not consistently, not clearly, but enough. A fragment of her first transmission had reached the base relay station incomplete, degraded, but enough for a trained signals operator to identify the call sign, the nature of the emergency, and the approximate grid. The signals operator's name was Corporal James Trant. He was 22 years old. He had been at this job for 8 months, and in 8 months, he had forwarded 4 emergency transmissions upward through the chain of command. He was good at his job. He was also, on this particular morning, about to witness something that would stay with him for the rest of his career. He flagged the transmission immediately and routed it to the operations center. Within 4 minutes, Major Gerald Simmons was looking at the data. Simmons looked at the grid. He looked at the threat assessment for that sector, which was in the clipped language of military intelligence documents, extremely high contested at all approach vectors. He looked at the weather overlay, which showed deteriorating conditions moving in from the northwest. He looked at the 2 available extraction assets, both of which were currently committed to supporting the primary reconnaissance mission. He looked at all of this for approximately 90 seconds. Then he said, "Flag it as unconfirmed. Continue monitoring." Corporal Trant stared at him. Sir, the call sign is confirmed. Echo 2-1 is a combat rescue element. I know what Echo 2-1 is, Corporal. Simmons's voice was not unkind. That was somehow worse than if it had been harsh. It was the voice of a man making a calculation he believed was rational, justified, and correct. The grid puts them in the middle of a sector where we cannot safely conduct an extraction at this time. We have a primary mission in progress with significantly higher strategic value. I am not going to compromise that mission and 2 air crews for 1 unconfirmed survivor signal. Sir, she said she was ambulatory. She said a lot of things on a broken transmitter from the middle of an active enemy position. What I need from you, Corporal, is for you to continue monitoring and log everything you receive. That is your mission right now. Trant wanted to say more. He could feel the words pressing against the inside of his chest like something that needed to get out. But he was 22 years old and Simmons was a major with 15 years and 3 combat deployments in the military runs on chain of command for reasons Trant believed in, especially when those reasons felt like they were crushing something essential. He logged the transmission. He continued monitoring. Simmons walked out of the signals room and headed to the main operations center to check on the status of the primary mission. That should have been the end of Emily Carter's story. It wasn't for a reason that nobody at Forward Operating Base Kilo anticipated Corporal James Trant had a conscience that was slightly stronger than his obedience. He didn't disobey Simmons's order. He logged everything. He monitored everything. But he also did one additional thing that was not technically outside his authorized duties, but was absolutely not what Simmons had intended. He flagged the transmission in the system as a secondary emergency beacon, which automatically pushed a notification to every unit within communication range that had the technical capability to receive the signal type. It was a loophole, a small one, the kind of thing you could justify 6 different ways if you had to. He justified it to himself. Very simply, if someone out there can hear her, they should know she's there. He had no idea who was in range. He had no idea if the notification would reach anyone who could act on it or anyone who would act on it, even if they could. He just sent it and went back to monitoring. 30 miles away in a narrow draw between 2 ridgelines, a 5-man Marine reconnaissance team was 11 hours into a 72-hour mission when the notification hit the communications officer's tablet. Staff Sergeant Daniel Hayes was not the communications officer. He was the team leader. He was standing 20 meters away studying a map overlay with his second in command when Corporal Alejandro Vega said quietly, "Sergeant." That was it, just the one word. But Hayes had been working with Vega for 2 years, and he knew every register of that voice. And this one meant, "Come here now and be quiet about it." He walked over. Vega held out the tablet without speaking. Hayes read it once, then he read it again. Then he looked up at the ridgeline above them, did a quick mental calculation of distance and terrain, and said equally quietly, "Pull it up on audio. Whatever's transmitting, I want to hear it." Vega connected the tablet to a compact receiver and began scanning the frequency range listed in the notification. For 2 minutes, there was nothing. Then through a wall of static, barely audible, something that was unmistakably a human voice. "This is Echo 2-1, wounded. No extraction, still alive." Hayes listened to it twice without speaking. Then he said, "How far?" Vega looked at his equipment. Signal strength suggests approximately 12 to 14 kilometers southeast. Hayes looked at the ridge line again. He looked at his watch. He looked at the map. "Get me command on secure channel," he said. "You're going to request permission," Vega asked. Not skeptical, just asking. Hayes didn't answer that directly. He said, "I'm going to make a call." The call lasted 6 minutes. Hayes did most of the talking. The voice on the other end did most of the refusing. The conversation ended with an order that was unambiguous and direct. Continue the assigned mission. Do not deviate from the assigned route. Do not respond to secondary emergency signals outside your operational sector. Hayes acknowledged the order. Then he ended the transmission, put the radio down, and looked at his 4 men. Corporal Vega, Private First Class Aaron Drum, Sergeant Leo Pacheco, Specialist Marcus Tong, 4 men who had trained together, bled together, carried each other's weight across terrain that would have destroyed people with less. He didn't make a speech. Hayes was not a man who made speeches. He said, "There's an American soldier 12 kilometers southeast. She's wounded, and she's been broadcasting for at least 3 hours with no response from command. We've been ordered to continue our assigned mission. He paused. I need to know where each of you stands. The silence lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then Pacheco said, I left my compass at that rock back there. We're going to have to backtrack to find it. Nobody laughed, but something shifted in the air. Drums said, while we're backtracking, we might as well take the southern road. Better cover. Southern road goes southeast, Tong said, studying the map with an expression of elaborate casualness. That's unfortunate. Vega was already repacking his kit. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Hayes looked at his team for one long moment. Then he said, move out. They were not following orders. Every one of them understood that. Every one of them understood what disobeying a direct order during an active operation could mean. The charges, the consequences, the way this could end their careers or worse. They moved out anyway, because there was a voice on the radio saying she was still alive. And that voice was running out of time. Miles away, Emily had found a position. It was a shallow depression in the rock face, partially concealed by a natural overhang, the kind of feature that wasn't a hiding place so much as a suggestion of one. It would only work if whoever was looking didn't look closely. But it was what she had, and she had made it work with what she carried, her emergency thermal blanket reversed to minimize signature, body positioned, low weapon across her right arm, left arm immobilized against her chest. She had been there for 6 hours. She had heard patrols pass within 40 meters twice. Both times she had controlled her breathing so precisely that the effort left her hands shaking when they passed. She had administered a second round of field treatment to her leg when the pain peaked beyond manageable. She had consumed exactly half of her emergency ration pack and 3/4 of her water discipline consumption, the kind you maintain not because you're not thirsty, but because you don't know how long the water has to last. She had tried the radio 17 times. The pattern was always the same. She would key the transmitter, give her call sign and grid, and wait. Sometimes the static would shift in a way that might have been a carrier wave from somewhere. Usually it was just static. She stopped expecting an answer. She didn't stop trying. There is a particular quality to the kind of hope that exists after you've stopped expecting. It's quieter than regular hope, less urgent, but it's also in some ways more durable because it's no longer dependent on a specific outcome at a specific time. It becomes less about believing rescue is coming and more about refusing to be the thing that prevents it. Emily kept transmitting because silence felt like surrender, and she had not surrendered yet. On the 18th try, something happened. She keyed the transmitter. This is Echo 2-1, wounded, no extraction, still alive. The static held for 3 seconds. Then a voice came through. Not command, not the operations center, not Major Simmons or any of the call signs she knew. A different voice, male, steady, close enough on the frequency that the words were clear. Echo 2-1, we have your signal. Say your status. Emily went very still. In the 6 hours since the crash, she had constructed a careful interior architecture of not hoping too hard. She had built it deliberately, and she had believed it would protect her from the particular devastation of a voice that turned out to be a hallucination or interference or something her exhausted mind had assembled from static because it desperately needed to hear. She keyed her transmitter. Identify yourself, she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. She was also terrified. The response came back in under 10 seconds. Reaper team, we're moving to your position. ETA approximately 4 hours. Hold your grid. Emily sat with that for a moment. Then she said, Reaper team, be advised, I have had no contact with command. I have no information on current patrol activity between your position and mine. I cannot confirm the route is clear. Copy that, the voice said. We're working with what we have. What's your medical status? She gave it to him accurately. Left arm compound fracture. Left leg probable fracture below the knee. Multiple lacerations controlled. No internal symptoms. Cognitively functional. Mobility limited but present. There was a brief pause. That's better than I expected, the voice said. I'm still here, Emily said. That tends to help. Another pause. Something in the quality of it suggested the man on the other end was almost smiling. My name is Hayes, the voice said. Staff Sergeant Daniel Hayes, Marine Reconnaissance. You're not alone anymore, Captain. Emily Carter had not cried once in the 6 hours since the crash. Not when she assessed the wreckage. Not when she treated her own injuries alone in the dark. Not when the radio returned nothing but static across 17 attempts. She did not cry now. But something in her chest shifted quietly and completely, the way a door does when someone finally turns the right key. "Copy Reaper team," she said. Her voice was still steady. "I'll be here." She settled back against the rock. She kept her weapon across her arm. She kept her eyes on the approaches to her position. And for the first time in 6 hours, she also kept something else. She kept count. Because someone was coming and she was going to be alive when they arrived. What she didn't know yet was that Hayes and his team had not simply decided to come for her. They had decided to do something far more complex and far more dangerous than a straightforward rescue. They were moving through terrain that their intelligence identified as active toward a survivor position they could only approximate with no air support, no extraction confirmation, and orders that explicitly told them not to be where they were going. They were doing it on trust, on the belief that the voice on the radio was real, that the grid was accurate, that they could move 12 kilometers through enemy territory and back with a wounded soldier and not lose anyone in the process. It was not a rational calculation. Hayes knew that. He had run the numbers in his head during the first 30 minutes of movement, the way you do when you're a leader, and you owe it to your people to be honest with yourself about what you're asking. The numbers were not good, but there was something Hayes had learned across 10 years and 3 combat tours that didn't show up in numbers. He had learned it the hard way on a different hillside in a different country when he had been the one broadcasting into static. And the only thing that kept him moving was the belief, not the knowledge, the belief that someone on the other end was listening. Someone had come for him that night. I didn't know this woman. He had never met her. But he knew the voice on the radio, the steadiness of it, the precision of it, the way she gave her medical status like a report, because falling apart was not something she was willing to do in front of a stranger. He knew that voice. He had used it himself. "Faster," he said quietly to his team as they moved through the dark. Nobody asked why, they just moved faster. And somewhere on a cold mountainside 12 kilometers away, a woman with a broken arm and a fractured leg kept her eyes open and her weapon ready and her radio set to receive, because someone had said they were coming, and she had decided to believe it. The night was not finished with any of them yet. Not Hayes and his team picking their way through terrain that wanted to kill them. Not Emily Carter counting the minutes in a shallow depression in the rock. Not Corporal James Trant, 30 miles away, staring at his monitoring equipment and not telling anyone what he had done. And certainly not the enemy fighters moving along the ridgeline, above Emily's position, getting closer with every passing hour, narrowing the window between the woman still fighting to survive and everything that wanted to make sure she didn't. The clock was running. The only question was which way it would run out. The first thing Hayes told his team before they moved another step was the one thing none of them wanted to hear. "If we get into contact and someone goes down," he said, his voice low, measured, the kind of voice that doesn't leave room for argument. "We don't stop, we push through. Stopping gets everyone killed." Nobody responded. They didn't need to. These were men who had heard versions of that sentence in various forms across multiple deployments, and they understood what it meant not as cruelty, but as math. The math of survival in terrain that did not forgive hesitation. Sergeant Leo Pacheco adjusted the strap on his pack and said simply, "Then let's not get into contact." "Outstanding plan," Corporal Vega said. They moved. Hour 1. The first 40 minutes were the kind of movement that exists in a separate category from walking. It was controlled falling, in some ways committing your body weight forward down a slope that wanted to turn an ankle or send you sliding, catching yourself committing again, covering ground in the dark without the luxury of a light source. The night vision equipment helped, but the terrain in this sector had a particular quality that no equipment fully compensated for. It was unpredictable in ways that maps didn't capture. A slope that looked consistent would suddenly drop 2 feet. A flat section would turn out to be loose shale that shifted underweight. Hayes moved point. He always moved point on night operations. It was a leadership philosophy that some of his superiors had questioned and none of his men ever had. If someone was going to step on something they shouldn't, Hayes wanted it to be him. They had covered approximately 3 kilometers when Specialist Marcus Tong, who was running communications, touched Hayes on the arm and held up 2 fingers. 2 contacts, moving parallel to their route, approximately 200 meters north. Hayes held up a fist. Everyone stopped. They went to ground without a sound. 5 men dissolving into the terrain with the practiced ease of people who have spent years learning to make themselves invisible. Hayes pressed himself flat and listened. He could hear them now, moving without particular caution, which told him they weren't hunting specifically, they were patrolling, sweeping the general area. The pace and the spacing between voices suggested 4, maybe 5 individuals. Hayes did not move. He did not signal. He simply waited. That was the thing civilians never fully understood about elite reconnaissance operators. The most important skill was never shooting or moving or communicating. It was waiting. It was the ability to lie perfectly still while every instinct screamed at you to do something, and trusting that stillness was at that moment the most aggressive thing you could do. 3 minutes passed. The patrol moved north. The voices faded. Hayes was on his feet 30 seconds later. "Push the pace," he said quietly. Nobody asked about the patrol. They understood it the same way Hayes did the patrol. Existing meant the area was active, which meant every minute they spent in transit was a minute the odds were moving against them. They pushed the pace. Hour 2. Back on the mountainside, Emily was doing something that an observer, if any observer had existed, might have found strange given her circumstances. She was talking, not into the radio. She had disciplined herself to use the transmitter only in scheduled intervals to conserve battery. She was talking to herself, but not in the way exhausted or delirious people talk to themselves, not rambling, not losing coherence. She was debriefing. It was a technique she had developed on her 3rd deployment, borrowed loosely from something a flight surgeon had mentioned in a stress inoculation training: verbalize your situation assessment. Out loud, in complete sentences. The act of forcing your brain to construct coherent language about your circumstances served as a continuous cognitive check. If you started losing coherence in the sentences, you had your first early warning sign that something was going wrong neurologically. "Left arm is stable," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "No increase in swelling beyond the initial assessment. Pain level is manageable, approximately a 6. Left leg." She pressed carefully against the boot. "Read the feedback, 7, but functional. No numbness, no tingling, circulation is intact." She paused. "Hydration is at roughly 40% of initial supply. Ration pack is at 60%. Ammunition," she checked without looking. "Feel the way you do when you've handled weapons long enough that your hands know them better than your eyes. Full magazine plus 7 rounds in the chamber." "Okay." She let out a slow breath. "You're okay," she said, and then quieter, "Stay okay." Somewhere above her, a loose rock fell and skidded down the slope. Emily went completely still. The difference between a rock dislodged by wind and a rock dislodged by a boot was, to an untrained ear, nothing. To Emily's ear, shaped by 11 deployments and more time in bad terrain than she could calculate, it was everything. Wind moves rock in a pattern. It has a rhythm that follows air current. A boot moves rock inconsistently, the release of weight, followed by the scramble for purchase, a slightly irregular displacement. This was a boot, a ramos. 2 boots, she corrected herself a second later. Moving slowly, someone being careful, she brought her sidearm up. She pressed herself tighter against the rock face. She controlled her breathing by counting, not by relaxing, but by counting, because counting kept the frontal lobe engaged, and the frontal lobe was the part that understood the difference between shooting and not shooting. The sound moved. She tracked it, and then it moved past. Not toward her, past her, 15 meters upslope, no more. Close enough that she could now hear breathing, 2 people moving in single file, their attention directed toward the valley below, rather than the depression in the rock face where she was lying. They were looking for the crash site. They were looking for the helicopter, or the evidence of it, or the people who had been in it. They were not looking for her specifically. Not yet. She waited for 4 full minutes after the sound faded before she allowed herself to move again. Then she very carefully and very deliberately repositioned herself 3 meters to the left into a section of the depression where the overhang was slightly deeper, the concealment marginally better. She did not panic. She did not rush. She moved the way she had been trained to move when the cost of a mistake was everything, methodically, quietly treating each motion as a decision that deserved its own moment of consideration. When she was repositioned, she checked her radio. 40 minutes until her next scheduled transmission window. She settled in. 40 minutes was a long time to wait when you were alone on a mountain with enemy fighters within shouting distance. It was also she had learned a manageable amount of time if you broke it down correctly. Not 40 minutes, 8 intervals of 5 minutes each. Each interval had a task, track, ambient. Sounds check, arm, check, leg check. Radio battery recount, ammunition. Verify concealment, perform breathing exercise, track ambient sounds again. The cycle repeated. The time moved. This was how Emily Carter survived things that should have killed her. Not through extraordinary courage, not through supernatural toughness, not through some quality that set her apart from ordinary human beings. Through the deliberate and relentless breaking down of impossible things into possible things, and then doing the possible things one after another until the impossible thing was behind her. It was in its way the most human kind of bravery there is. Hour 3. Hayes called a rest at the 4-kilometer mark. 2 minutes. He used the 2 minutes to get a signal check on Emily's transmitter frequency and confirm the direction of signal origin against their current bearing. Signal's getting stronger, Tung said, studying his equipment with the focused expression of a man who took data very personally. We're on track. How much stronger? Enough. We've covered maybe a third of the lateral distance, but the terrain's going to get worse before it gets better. He pointed at the map overlay on his tablet, tracing a section that the contour lines compressed into something that looked like a test pattern. This section here is going to cost us time. Hayes looked at the section. He looked at his watch. He ran the calculation. We move faster through it, he said. Tong looked up from the tablet. Faster through that. You have a better option. Tong looked back at the tablet. No, he admitted. Then faster. Private First Class Aaron Drum, who was the youngest member of the team by 3 years and had the particular quality of young soldiers who don't fully grasp what they're in yet, while simultaneously being completely committed to it, said, "What happens if command figures out what we're doing before we reach her?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Hayes looked at him, not unkindly. "Then we'll have a very interesting conversation when we get back," Hayes said. "And if they send someone to stop us?" "They won't." "How do you know?" Hayes was quiet for a second. Then, "Because to send someone to stop us, they'd have to admit they know where we are. And if they admit they know where we are, they have to explain why they haven't sent anyone to extract a wounded American officer from the same grid we're currently walking toward." He let that settle. "Command is not going to have that conversation, Drum. Not on record." Drum processed this. You could almost see the calculation moving behind his eyes the way young people look when they realize that the gap between what institutions say and what institutions do is not always cynical, but it is always real. "So we're protected by their own silence," Drum said slowly. "More or less. That's a very weird kind of cover." "Welcome to the military," Pacheco said pleasantly and stood up. They moved. Hour 4. The difficult terrain section was exactly as bad as Tong's map suggested, and slightly worse in practice. It required at several points the kind of movement that wasn't tactically sound by any standard: exposed traverses across open faces, single-file movement along ledge sections where a fall would have meant serious injury at minimum. Hayes led every one of these sections. His team followed. Nobody spoke more than was necessary. On the third ledge section, Pacheco's foot slipped. It happened fast, the sound of boot leather on wet rock, a sharp intake of breath. And then Hayes's hand was there gripping Pacheco's vest, taking the weight, holding it until Pacheco's other foot found purchase. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then they were both pressed against the rock face, breathing. "I've got you," Hayes said. He said it quietly, calmly, the way you say something when it's already true and you just want the other person to know it. Pacheco steadied himself. "Yeah," he said. His voice was slightly rough. "Yeah, okay. Take a second. I'm good. Take a second anyway." Pacheco took 3 seconds. Then he nodded and they continued. That exchange, 4 seconds on a ledge in the dark on a mountain in enemy territory, was not in any mission report. It never would be. It was one of 10,000 small moments that happened in operations like this that nobody recorded and nobody decorated and nobody talked about afterward because they were not the kind of thing that fit in reports or citations. They were just the thing that kept people from falling. Hayes understood this. It was part of why he'd been doing this for 10 years and still believed in it. Not the grand moments, those existed and they mattered, but they were separated by vast stretches of these smaller ones. The hand on the vest, the 2 seconds of waiting, the quiet acknowledgement that someone's weight was worth catching. Emily Carter understood this too, though she didn't know Hayes existed yet. She understood it in the way that people who have spent their careers in extremity come to understand things not as philosophy, but as practice, as the thing you do without thinking, because the thinking has been replaced by habit, and the habit has been replaced by something deeper than either. She was in the middle of her fourth transmission interval when the radio crackled. Echo 2-1 Reaper team, status check, respond if able. She keyed the transmitter immediately. Reaper Echo 2-1, I'm solid. Patrol activity increased in the last 2 hours. Estimate 3 separate elements moving the ridgeline above my position. A brief pause. Then Hayes' voice level. Copy. How close? Closest pass was 15 meters approximately 90 minutes ago. They don't have a fix on my position, but they're systematically clearing the area. The search pattern is tightening. Another pause. Longer this time. We're going to need you to move, Hayes said. Emily felt something shift in her stomach. She had known this was coming. She had been calculating it herself for the last hour. The search pattern above her was going to close on her position within the next 3 to 4 hours at its current rate. Moving was going to cost her. Her leg was worse than her initial assessment, and she'd known it for the last 90 minutes, but hadn't said so on the radio because there was nothing Hayes could do about it from where he was. And she saw no value in adding that to his operational picture until he was close enough for it to be relevant. Understood, she said. Give me a bearing. Hayes gave her a bearing and a distance, approximately 800 meters, to a secondary position that would put her deeper into cover and, more importantly, closer to their line of approach. 800 meters, with her arm immobilized and her leg the way it was. She looked at the space between her current position and the direction Hayes had given her. Reaper, be advised, I'm going to be slower than a standard movement rate, she said. How slow? She ran the calculation honestly. Roughly twice the standard time. Maybe more. There was no judgment in the pause that followed, just Hayes running his own calculations. Okay, he said, move when you're ready. We'll adjust our pace. Keep the channel clear unless you need us. Copy. She put the radio down and looked at her left leg. All right, she said to no one in particular. Let's go. Hour 5. What Emily did in the next 90 minutes was something that a physical therapist told about it afterward would describe as inadvisable, and a combat surgeon would describe it as remarkable, and Emily herself would describe when pressed as necessary. She moved. Every step on the left leg was a decision. Not an automatic physical process, a decision. She had to consciously override the pain response each time, which meant each step required its own small act of oil. 800 meters. On flat ground in good conditions, that was a 10-minute walk. On this terrain with this injury, she covered it in 87 minutes. She counted steps. She had done this before, not with this injury, but in other circumstances, where the distance between where she was and where she needed to be seemed beyond what her body was willing to do. Counting steps worked because it gave the mind something to do that wasn't calculating the remaining distance, which was the kind of calculation that could break you if you let it. She counted to 100, then she started over. At step 63 of her third set of 100, she went down. Her left foot caught on a section of rock that she hadn't seen in the dark, and the sudden jar of uncontrolled weight on the fractured leg sent a spike of pain up through her body that temporarily wiped out everything. Sight, sound, thought, everything except the white-hot fact of the pain itself. She did not cry out. She pressed her face against the rock and made a sound that was not quite a sound, a long, controlled exhalation that was louder in her body than it was in the air around her. Then she lay still for exactly 10 seconds. Then she got up, not gracefully, not smoothly. She got up the way something gets up that has been knocked down and refuses to accept that as the final state of affairs, hands and knees first. Then one foot, then the other, then upright, then moving. 64, 65, 66. When she reached the secondary position, she had been on the move for 87 minutes and she had fallen twice. She had not transmitted either fall to Hayes. She had decided in the specific and clear-eyed way of a person who has simplified everything down to what is and is not useful, that he could not help her fall less, And so telling him served no purpose other than to create concern that would cost him focus. When she transmitted her arrival at the secondary position, she said, Reaper Echo 2-1, I'm at the secondary grid. Movement took longer than estimated. Hayes's response came back within seconds. Good copy, how are you? It was a simple question, the simplest kind. She thought about the two falls, about the way her leg had felt when she got up the second time, the new quality of the pain that suggested the fracture had moved slightly, not dramatically, but enough to register. About the sweat that had dried cold against her skin during the last section of movement, and the way her hands were shaking now with a fine tremor that she was attributing to exertion and refusing to attribute to anything else. I'm functional, she said. That's not what I asked. She was quiet for a moment. I'm here, she said finally. That's what counts. Hayes was quiet on his end for a moment too. Then yeah, he said, that's what counts. ETA to your position approximately 3 hours. Hold tight. Copy, she said. Reaper, are you going to get in trouble for this? The pause this time was different, thoughtful. Probably, Hayes said. Then why are you doing it? She heard something on the other end that wasn't quite a sound, the same kind of controlled exhalation she had made when she went down on the slope. And then Hayes said simply, same reason you're still transmitting. She didn't respond to that. She didn't need to. She settled into the secondary position, checked her concealment, checked her weapon, and began counting. Hour 6. At forward operating base, Kilo Corporal James Trant was staring at his monitoring screen at 0347 local time when Major Simmons walked into the signals room. Trant had not slept. He was not supposed to be monitoring at this hour. His shift had ended 90 minutes ago. But he had stayed anyway, claiming a paperwork backlog, which was technically not a lie because the paperwork was there. He was just not doing it. He was monitoring. I was monitoring because the last transmission from Echo 2-1 that he had logged had included movement, a change in the signal origin point that his equipment had captured even through the degraded transmission quality. She had moved. She was alive and moving, which meant she was fighting, which meant everything. Simmons had written off as resolved, was still very much unresolved. When Simmons walked in, Trant's first instinct was to switch screens. He suppressed it. The second instinct was to say nothing. He suppressed that too. Sir, he said, I need to show you something. Simmons looked at him. Something in Trant's voice, the particular flatness of it, the way it sat between deference and determination, made him walk over instead of dismissing it. Trant pulled up the transmission logs, Echo 2-1, 17 transmissions over 6 hours, signal origin point shifting. Most recent transmission 13 minutes ago from a position 800 meters east of the original crash site. She's mobile, Trant said. She's been transmitting consistently, and she's mobile, which means she's been alive and fighting this whole time, and he stopped himself, started again. She's been broadcasting for 6 hours, sir. Simmons stared at the screen. She's not alone, Trant added. He pulled up a second data layer. Approximately 2 hours ago, I detected a second transmission on an adjacent frequency. Short burst encrypted, but the signal origin places it approximately 12 kilometers west of Echo 2-1's current position and moving toward it. Simmons's expression changed. Who is that? He said. His voice had a new quality to it. Tighter. I don't know officially, Trant said. He was choosing his words very carefully. The encryption signature is consistent with a marine reconnaissance element. If I had to speculate, don't speculate, Corporal. The signal is moving toward her, sir, at a rate consistent with a 5-person team moving through difficult terrain under combat conditions, and it is closing the distance. Simmons stared at the screen for a long moment. The silence in the room was the kind that has weight. If someone has gone off mission to attempt a rescue without authorization, Simmons said slowly, that is a serious disciplinary matter. Yes, sir. And if that someone gets killed in the process or triggers a contact that compromises the primary mission, the consequences are significant. Yes, sir. Simmons turned to look at Trant directly. Why are you showing me this? Trant met his eyes. Because, sir, he said, if they reach her and bring her out, someone is going to have to explain how an American officer spent 6 hours broadcasting from behind enemy lines with no response from her command element. And I thought it would be better for you to be looking at this screen than to be the one who found out about it when they walk back through the wire. That was a long sentence for a corporal to direct at a major. Trant knew it. His hands were perfectly steady, which surprised him. Simmons looked at him for a long moment. Something moved behind the major's eyes, a series of calculations that Trant was not senior enough to fully read, but senior enough to partially understand. "Keep monitoring," Simmons said finally. "Log everything." "Yes, sir." "Everything." "Yes, sir." Simmons stood for a moment longer. Then he said quietly, more to himself than to Trant, 6 hours. He walked out. Trant turned back to his screen. He logged the major's visit. He logged the conversation. He logged the timestamp. Then he went back to monitoring, because somewhere out there 2 signals were moving toward each other on a mountain in the dark, and he intended to watch them meet. Hour 7. Hayes knew they had a problem 30 minutes before the problem fully presented itself. It was Pacheco who caught it first. He came up beside Hayes without a word and pointed 2 fingers, then east, then up. Hayes read the signal and stopped the team. He looked east. He looked up. Through the night vision, he could see what Pacheco had seen: movement on the ridgeline above and ahead of them. Not one element, at least 2, possibly 3, moving in a pattern that was not random. Patrol, but coordinated search. The kind of movement that meant someone above them was working a grid. The problem was that the grid they were working included the approach route Hayes had intended to use to reach Emily's position. Hayes pulled the team together, shoulders touching, voices below a whisper. "Change of route," he said. "We go around the south face." "That adds at least 40 minutes, Tong said. "Yes. And it takes us through that exposed section by the secondary ridgeline." "Yes." Tong accepted this. He was not a man who argued with assessments he couldn't improve on. "Okay. Pacheco, you're on rear security. Drum close up behind Vega. We move single file and we move quiet." He looked at each of them. "We are close," he said. "She is close. We don't stop." They moved south. What Hayes did not tell his team, not because he was hiding it, but because he was still deciding what it meant, was that the movement pattern he had observed on the ridge line had a specific quality that concerned him more than simple patrol activity. The elements were moving in a contraction pattern, moving toward a center point, which meant they either had a fix on something or they were tightening a search net around an area they expected someone to be in. Either way, it meant Emily's current position might be compromised within the next hour. He needed to move faster. He also needed to warn her, but a transmission from his position would give away their direction of approach to anyone scanning frequencies in this sector. And right now, his approach was the only advantage he had. He kept moving. He kept the calculation running in the back of his head. Emily's most recent position, the contraction rate of the ridgeline, elements his current approach speed. Numbers feeding each other in a loop that wouldn't resolve neatly, no matter how many times he ran it. This was the part of the job that nobody talked about. Not the physical demands, not the tactical complexity, not even the fear. Fear could be managed, filed, put somewhere it didn't interfere. What nobody talked about was this: the moment when you have committed everything. Your team's lives, your career, your direct orders, everything to a course of action, and the variables start multiplying faster than you can track. And you understand with complete clarity that you are no longer in control of the outcome, that the outcome is going to happen to you rather than being produced by you. The only thing left in that moment is to be worth what's been committed. Hayes moved faster. He didn't bargain. He didn't spiral into the catastrophe scenarios that his brain was helpfully generating and offering to him at regular intervals. He just moved. And 23 minutes later, Tong touched his arm and pointed at the signal locator, and the locator showed a blinking point approximately 600 meters ahead and slightly north. 600 meters. Hayes looked at the terrain between them and that point. He looked at the ridge line above. He looked at his watch. Then he keyed his transmitter, kept the transmission to 2 seconds, no call sign, just a single tone on Emily's frequency. 1 ping, that was all. Emily's response came back in under 5 seconds. 1 ping returned. "I hear you. I know you're coming." Hayes exhaled once. 600 meters, he told his team. Pacheco said nothing. But Hayes saw the thing that happened in his posture, the particular way a person's body changes when the end of something becomes real and close and achievable. Not relaxation, the opposite of relaxation, the kind of focus that comes from knowing you are almost there, and that almost is the most dangerous place to be because almost is where people stop being careful. "Eyes open," Hayes said, "all the way in." They covered the next 400 meters in 21 minutes. The last 200 meters were the most difficult of the entire approach. The search elements on the ridgeline had tightened further. Hayes could hear them voices movement, the occasional flash of a light source that the night vision turned into a blinding bloom. They were close. Too close. The margin between Hayes's team and those elements was measured in meters and minutes, and the particular variable of whether anyone looked down at the right angle at the right moment. Drum was the one who almost made a sound. A loose section of ground gave way under his right foot, and he went to one knee with a displacement of rock that was by any objective measure not very loud, but loud enough. In the darkness above them, one of the voices changed, sharpened, directed, moving from background conversation to alert attention. Everyone froze. Hayes did not breathe. He was not sure any of them breathed. 30 seconds, 40, 50. The voice above gradually returned to its previous quality. Movement resumed in the original pattern. Hayes turned to look at Drum. Drum looked back at him. His face was the color of someone who has just understood in a very direct and physical way how small the margin is between fine and not fine. Hayes gave him a single nod. Drum nodded back. They moved. And then Hayes rounded a section of rock and stopped. Because crouched against the face of the rock, sidearm up, covered position, exactly where the signal locator said she would be, was Emily Carter. She looked at him for exactly 1 second. She looked the way people look when they have been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and someone has just arrived to help carry it, not relieved yet, not safe yet, but for the first time, not alone. Carter, he said quietly. Hayes, she said back. He crouched beside her and looked at her arm and her leg with the practiced assessment of someone who has done this before. You look like you've had a rough day, he said. You're late, she said. Something moved at the edge of his expression. Not quite a smile. The territory just north of 1. We had to take the scenic route, he said. She looked at the 4 men behind him, taking them in one at a time with the quick, efficient assessment of a combat officer reading a force posture. Your team disobeyed orders to come here, she said. We lost our compass, Hayes said. We've been looking for it. She looked at him. Thank you, she said. He held her gaze for one moment, long enough to mean something. Don't thank me yet, he said. We still have to get you out. He turned to his team. Tongue full scan on the ridgeline elements. Pacheco North approach. Drum you're with Carter. Vega on me. He looked at Emily. Can you move? She was already pushing herself upright. Watch me, she said. And the thing was, he did. He watched her get to her feet on a fractured leg in enemy territory after 7 hours alone on a mountain, and he watched her check her weapon and adjust her grip with her one functional arm, and he watched her look at him with eyes that had not stopped being sharp even after everything those hours had cost her. And what Hayes thought in that moment was not tactical. It was not operational. What he thought was, this is someone who was never going to stop fighting. What he felt, though he would not have called it that in any report or debrief, was something close to awe. Let's move, he said, because they were 6 people on a mountainside with enemy search elements contracting above them and 8 kilometers of hostile ground between them and anything resembling safety. They were together now, but the hardest part had not happened yet, and every one of them knew it. They moved as one unit now, and that changed everything about the math. Not the terrain, not the number of enemy elements on the ridgeline above them, not the distance between their current position in the extraction zone, which Tong had quietly calculated at 7.4 kilometers, a number he had shared with Hayes and Hayes alone, because some numbers needed to be carried by the person responsible for the decision before they got distributed to the people responsible for executing it. What changed was the weight. Emily had been carrying everything alone for 7 hours. Every decision, every risk assessment, every moment of pain management and noise discipline and weapon readiness, she had carried it all inside a skull that had been running on adrenaline and trained will since the moment she pulled herself out of the wreckage. That kind of carrying leaves a mark you can't see from the outside. It compresses something in a person. And when it's suddenly distributed, when 5 other people are suddenly sharing the load, the compression releases, and what comes out of that release is not weakness. It's a different kind of strength, a collective one. Hayes felt the shift in his team the moment they incorporated Emily. They moved differently, tighter, with a purpose that had been present before, but was now visible in a way it hadn't been, because now there was a person in the middle of their formation who represented everything the mission meant. She was not abstract. She was not a grid coordinate or a call sign. She was a woman with a fractured leg and a broken arm who had refused to die, and she was right there moving with them. And every one of them felt the specific gravity of that. Drum was beside her. Hayes had assigned him there because Drum was the youngest and the most physically capable. And if Emily's leg gave out at the wrong moment, Drum was the one who could catch her and keep moving without breaking the formation's pace. It was a tactical decision. It was also something else. The first 200 meters out of her position were the most dangerous. The search elements above had not moved to a significantly different position since Hayes had first observed them, but the tightening pattern had continued, which meant their window for clearing the immediate area was narrowing. Hayes kept the pace aggressive without making it careless, the specific balance that experienced operators understand as the difference between speed and recklessness, and that less experienced ones sometimes fail to find until something goes wrong. Nothing went wrong in those first 200 meters. At the 200-meter mark, Pacheco touched Hayes' arm. His signal contact left flank close. The team went to ground. Mark hour 7:40 minutes. Emily went down with them, absorbing the impact on her good leg, and one arm controlling the other side enough that the fractured arm didn't take weight. She was beside Drum. She could feel the tension in him, that particular quality of young soldiers in their first real close contact moment, where the training is fully engaged, but the body hasn't yet caught up with the training's confidence. She put her hand on his arm, not to restrain him, not because she thought he would do something wrong. She put it there because it was what someone had done for her once on her third deployment when she was Aaron Drum's age, and a contact came in from the left flank, and she had wanted very badly to move before she was supposed to. Someone had put a hand on her arm. That's all. And it had been exactly enough. Drum's breathing slowed. Good, she thought. Good. The contact Pacheco had flagged was a single individual, moving along the base of the slope, approximately 60 meters to their left. Moving slowly, the pace of someone searching, rather than patrolling, attention directed toward the ground rather than the horizon. A tracker, possibly, looking for signs of movement, footprints, disturbed rock, the kind of evidence that 7 people moving through rough terrain inevitably leave behind. Hayes watched him for 90 seconds. The individual moved south, away from their position, away from the direction they needed to go. Hayes awaited 30 more seconds, then signaled move. They moved. Emily kept pace. Hayes checked her once, a quick, sideways glance that she caught and read correctly. "I'm fine," she said at a volume that was technically below a whisper, a shaped exhalation rather than a voice sound. He nodded and looked forward. They covered the next kilometer in 38 minutes, which was not fast by any standard measure and was, given the terrain and the conditions and the person in the middle of their formation, something close to extraordinary. At the 1-kilometer mark, Tunga did a full signal scan. The results were not good. Mark hour 8, "We've got a problem," Tung said. The team had stopped in a shallow depression. Not a position, just a pause while Hayes assessed the next section of route. Tung came up beside him with his tablet and kept his voice at the level that sound ceases to travel beyond 3 meters. Hayes looked at the screen. The ridgeline elements had not dispersed. They had dropped. In the 38 minutes since the team had cleared Emily's position, the search elements had descended significantly from the ridgeline and were now moving along the slope in a pattern that intersected with 2 of the 3 viable routes to the extraction zone, 2 of 3, which left 1. Hayes studied the remaining route. It was the one he had mentally tagged as the least preferred option when he had first assessed the terrain from a distance. It required crossing an open section that offered limited concealment, and it bent north before it turned toward the extraction zone, adding distance to an already demanding movement. "How's the extraction window?" he asked Tong. "First window opens in 94 minutes. Second window is 40 minutes after that. If we miss the second window, we won't miss the second window." Tung looked at the route. He looked at the 94-minute timeline. He looked at Hayes with the expression of a man who has done the same math his superior just did and arrived at the same uncomfortable answer. "The north route puts us at the zone in approximately 80 minutes if nothing goes wrong," Tung said. "And if something goes wrong," Tung didn't answer that. "Okay," Hayes said. He turned to the team. He looked at Emily. She had been listening. She was already looking back at him. "You heard," he said. "North route," she said. "Open a crossing. Extraction window in 94 minutes. Yes. He nodded. Your assessment? Washington. Emily looked at the direction Tinga had indicated on the tablet. She thought for a moment, not calculating whether it was possible, but calculating what it would cost and whether that cost was payable. If the crossing takes longer than 12 minutes, we're exposed for too long, she said. We need to move through it without stopping. No matter what. Hayes looked at her arm, at the way she was distributing her weight. No matter what, he repeated. No matter what, she confirmed. Her voice was flat and certain in the way that people are flat and certain when they have already made a decision and are communicating a result rather than reasoning through a process. Pacheco was watching her. He was a man who had spent 11 years reading people in high-stakes situations, and he was reading her now with the full attention that kind of experience produces. What he read was not bravado. It was not denial. It was the specific resolve of someone who has already spent 7 hours deciding over and over and over again that they are going to survive this, and for whom one more decision in that same direction costs less than you might think. He looked at Hayes. Hayes looked at his watch. We move in 2 minutes, he said. Mark hour 8:20 minutes. The crossing was 160 meters of terrain that felt to each of the 6 people crossing it like it was approximately 3 times that length. Hayes went first. That was not a discussion or a decision. It was simply what happened because it was always what happened. He crossed in 2 minutes and 14 seconds. He reached the far side and immediately went to a covered position and scanned. Then he signaled. Vega went 1 minute 58 seconds. Pacheco, 2 minutes 6 seconds, Drum and Emily together. Hayes had made that call before they started because Emily's pace on the crossing terrain was going to be slower, and Drum needed to be with her, and separating them would create a gap in the crossing that was tactically unacceptable. Drum understood, Emily understood, they went. It took 3 minutes and 41 seconds. Hayes watched the entire 3 minutes and 41 seconds without breathing at a normal rate. He watched the ridgeline. He watched the slope below the ridgeline. He watched Emily's movement with the specific attention of a person who has committed everything to an outcome and is tracking every variable that could change it. She moved the way she had told him she would move without stopping. Her left leg was not right. He could see that in the way she placed it. The micro-adjustment she made each time it took weight, the way the rest of her body compensated in the pattern of someone managing pain through motion rather than despite it. But she moved. She didn't pause. She didn't flag. Drum was beside her the whole way, close enough to catch, distant enough to let her carry herself. When they reached Hayes's position, Emily exhaled once and leaned against the rock face for exactly 3 seconds. Then she straightened. Time, she asked. 3:41, Hayes said. Good, she said. That's under 4. Tongue was already scanning from the covered position. No alert on the ridgeline, we're clean. Something moved through the team, not relief because they weren't out yet, but the particular recalibration that happens when a feared thing passes without consequence. The next 20 meters always feel slightly different after that. They moved. Mark hour 8:50 minutes, twist 1. Tongue heard it first. He held up a fist and the team stopped with the automatic precision of people who have trained the stop reflex until it lives below the level of thought. Everyone listened. At first, nothing. Then, just at the threshold of audibility, a sound that Hayes placed in under 2 seconds. Rotary aircraft. Multiple. Moving from the southwest, the wrong direction for the extraction window. Hayes and Tongue looked at each other. That's not our birds, Tongue said. No, Hayes agreed. Emily said very quietly, they're looking for us. The team had known this was a possibility. You don't move a 5-man reconnaissance element off its assigned mission without eventually triggering a response from someone who notices the mission is no longer being executed. The question had always been when, not whether. The answer was now. The aircraft, 2 of them, Hayes estimated from the sound, likely lighted utility variants used for fast search, pattern coverage, were sweeping the area in a pattern that was going to intersect with their current position within approximately 8 minutes. 8 minutes. Hayes pulled the team together. His voice was so low it was almost a vibration. We need to be underground in the next 6 minutes. Tongue, anything on the map in our immediate area? Tongue was already looking. There's a drainage channel running north-south approximately 200 meters east of our position. It's not deep, but it offers overhead concealment if the banks are high enough. They'll be high enough, Emily said. Hayes looked at her. I spent 7 hours studying this terrain, she said. The drainage channels in this sector run between 2.5 and 3 meters deep. I know because I was calculating which ones I could reach if the patrols forced me off my primary position. She met his eyes. 200 meters east is the right move. 2 minutes of information that was worth more than any map overlay. Move, Hayes said. They covered the 200 meters in 6 minutes in 40 seconds, which was faster than it had any right to be and slower than Hayes wanted it to be. When the drainage channel opened up in front of them, it was, as Emily had said, deep enough. They dropped into it, all six in the order they'd been moving. The aircraft sound grew. Then it was overhead, a heavy thrumming that pressed down on all of them like a physical weight, the kind of sound that when it's associated with something hostile, reaches into the primitive parts of the brain and triggers responses that all the training in the world can reduce but never fully eliminate. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Emily was between Drum and Vega. She had her eyes open and her breathing controlled, and her weapon in her one good hand at a position that was not aggressive but was absolutely ready. She was looking at the bank above them. Drum was looking at her, looking at the bank. Much later in a conversation he would have with Pacheco over coffee in a base somewhere very far from this mountain, Drum would try to describe what it was like to watch Emily Carter in that drainage channel while the aircraft were overhead. He would struggle with the words for a moment, and then he would say, "She was the most calm person in that ditch, and she was the most hurt. I've never understood that. I still don't fully understand it." And Pacheco would nod and say, "You will eventually. It's what happens when someone has already decided they're not done." The aircraft passed. The sound receded north. Hayes counted 60 seconds of silence before he signaled. They climbed out of the channel. 4 kilometers to extraction zone, Tong said. 51 minutes to first window. "We're going to make the first window," Hayes said. It was not a prediction. It was a decision. Mark hour 9, 3 kilometers from the extraction zone, Pacheco's radio lit up. It was an encrypted burst transmission command channel, which meant it had cut through the operational security protocols that Hayes had engaged at the start of this deviation from their assigned mission. Someone at command had pushed hard enough through the system to reach them directly. Hayes took the handset. The voice on the other end was not Major Simmons. It was Colonel Richard Farr, the senior operational commander for the entire sector. A man Hayes had met twice in 3 years, and both times briefly. A man whose involvement in any specific field operation at this level of detail meant that what was happening had moved significantly up the chain. "Reaper lead, this is Farr. Authenticate." Hayes authenticated. "What is your current status?" Farr said. Hayes looked at his team. He looked at Emily. He looked at the 4 kilometers of terrain between them and the extraction zone and the 49 minutes to the first window. He made a decision in approximately 2 seconds. "Reaper team is conducting a combat recovery operation," he said. "We have located and secured 1 survivor from Echo 21 flight. Survivor is ambulatory, injuries are significant but stable. We are 4 kilometers from primary extraction zone, ETA to zone approximately 40 minutes. The silence on the other end lasted 5 seconds. "You are aware," Farr said, "that you are operating outside your assigned mission parameters." "Yes, sir." "You were given a direct order to continue your assigned mission." "Yes, sir." Another pause. "Is the survivor able to travel?" "She's been traveling for the last 9 hours, sir, with or without us." A longer pause this time. Hayes waited. He was good at waiting. "Reaper leader," Farr said, "I am dispatching a dedicated extraction asset to your grid. It will be on station at the extraction zone in 43 minutes. Do not miss that window." Hayes exhaled once. "Copy, sir. We won't miss it." And Hayes, "Sir, we're going to have a conversation when you're back on the wire." "Yes, sir." "Good work," Farr said. The transmission ended. Hayes looked at his team. Vega was watching him with an expression that was trying very hard not to be a grin and not quite succeeding. Pacheco was looking at the sky in the way people look at the sky when they're experiencing an emotion they don't want to put on their face. Drum had his eyes closed for exactly 3 seconds, then opened them. Tong just said, 43 minutes, 4 kilometers. "Enough," Hayes said. "Move." Emily had listened to the entire exchange. She had not asked what Farr had said. She had read Hayes's face instead, and what she had read was enough. She moved. Mark hour 9:20 minutes, twist 2. The contact came from behind them. It was not random. It was not a patrol stumbling across their route. It was deliberate. The movement pattern told Hayes immediately that the search elements from the ridgeline had identified their track and were now following it. Someone up there had been doing their job, and they had found the evidence that 7 people leave when they move through terrain that doesn't hide footprints well. 2 elements converging from the northeast and the northwest. The angles were bad. The timing was worse. How many? Emily said. She had moved up beside Hayes the moment he stopped. She wasn't asking out of anxiety. She was asking for the information she needed to be useful. Northeast 3 minimum, Hayes said. Northwest I can't confirm yet. Pacheco. At least 2 northwest, Pacheco said from the rear. Moving fast. What's this? Too fast for a standard patrol, Emily said. They have a fix. Yeah. She looked at the terrain ahead of them. The extraction zone was 3 kilometers out, and the contact elements were, by Hayes's estimate, approximately 6 minutes behind them. She did the math out loud because Hayes needed to hear it as much as she needed to say it. If we run, we can open the gap. But running on this terrain costs us control. We get louder, we make more track, and anyone ahead of us hears us coming. If we hold and engage, we slow them down, but we lose time on the extraction window. She paused. There's a third option. Hayes looked at her. Diversion, she said. 1 element breaks away, makes noise to the north, draws the northeast contact off the main body's line. The main body continues to the extraction zone on the southern road. 1 element, Hayes repeated. Small, 1 or 2 people. She met his eyes. It doesn't have to be a prolonged engagement. Just enough misdirection to shift their vector. Hayes looked at her for a moment. Then he said, You're thinking about volunteering for the diversion. I have the most terrain knowledge of this sector, she said. I spent 7 hours learning it, and I'm the slowest member of this formation, which means I'm the variable that's most likely to cost you the extraction window. You are also injured and have 1 functional arm, Hayes said. I have Pacheco, she said. He stays with me. We create the diversion, then we push south on a different vector and meet you at the zone. Hayes stared at her. There was a version of this conversation that existed entirely in the territory of tactics, risk assessment, probability, timing, geometry. And in that version, Emily's proposal had a certain cold logic to it. It was not a good plan, but it was a plan that gave the most people the best chance of making the extraction window. There was another version of this conversation, the human one, in which Hayes had just spent 9 hours and every resource he had getting to this woman and was being asked to walk away from her again. He ran both versions simultaneously. That was the specific torture of command. He was still running them when Pacheco spoke. She's right about the terrain, Pacheco said quietly. He was looking at Hayes. And she's right about the pace, but I want to offer a modification. Say it, Hayes said. Drum goes with Carter. I take point on the main body. Drum is fast enough to keep up with any pace she can set, and he can carry her if he has to. Pacheco said it evenly without drama. I've been the second in command on this team for 2 years. I can get Tong and Vega to the zone without you. Hayes looked at Drum. Drum was 22 years old and had been a Marine for 3 of those years, and he looked at Hayes with an expression that was trying to be calm and was about 80% successful. I'm good, Drum said. Hayes looked at Emily. She was looking back at him the way she had in her original position, that same directness, that same complete absence of hedging. She had made her assessment, and she had offered it, and she was waiting for his answer, with the patience of someone who has learned that pushing doesn't make decisions move faster. Hayes took 4 seconds. Then, Carter Drum diversion element. North approach 3 to 4 minutes, then break south-southwest for the zone. Do not engage unless you have no other option. Your mission is to redirect, not to fight. Understood, Emily said. Drum, she's in charge. Whatever she says. Drum looked at Emily. Emily looked at Drum. Something passed between them, 2 people of very different ages and experience levels, arriving at the same understanding. Yes, sir, Drum said. He gripped Emily's arm, her right arm, the good one. I will see you at the zone, he said. It was not a question. You will, she said. And they split. Mark hour 9:30 minutes. Emily moved north with Drum at a pace that cost her, and she paid it without complaint. The diversion was simple in concept, create enough auditory signature in the northern approach to redirect the northeast contact element away from the main body's southern route. The execution required getting far enough north that the redirection made geometric sense, making enough controlled noise to be credited without triggering a full pursuit response, and then braking south with sufficient speed to make the extraction zone before the window closed. Emily knew the terrain. She moved through it with Drum beside her, guiding him through a sequence of features she had cataloged in her mind. Across 7 hours of lying still and listening and watching the loose section above the northern draw that produced sound out of proportion to the disturbance, the echo effect against the eastern face that made two people sound like more. She used all of it. Here, she told Drum, and she directed him to kick through a section of loose shale that scattered down the slope in a racket that in the night quiet of the mountain was absolutely directional and absolutely convincing. She heard the northeast contact element respond, voices sharpening, movement redirecting. Now, she said to Drum, south, fast as you can. He looked at her leg. I'll keep up, she said. Move. He moved. She moved with him. The next 18 minutes were the most purely physical demand that Emily's body had absorbed in the entire operation. She was asking a fractured leg to run, which it could not do correctly, but it could do something that was close enough to running that the distance closed and the extraction zone grew closer on Tong's grid, and the aircraft sound when it came growing from the south unmistakably American. Unmistakably extraction was the most beautiful sound she had heard in 9 hours and 40 minutes. She heard Hayes's voice on the radio. Reaper lead to all elements. Bird is on approach. 2 minutes. Drum grabbed her good arm and pulled, not because she was falling, but because the extraction zone was visible now. And sometimes the body needs the reminder that it's almost over. That almost has become actually that the thing that seemed impossible from the inside of it is now close enough to touch. 2 minutes, Drum said. You got this. I know, she said. She ran. Not well, not smoothly. With every compensation and adjustment in managed catastrophe of a fractured leg and a broken arm and 9 hours of a mountain that had tried very hard to keep her on it. She ran with Drum beside her and Hayes's voice in her earpiece and the aircraft sound growing and the ground moving beneath her feet. And when she cleared the last section of terrain and saw Hayes standing at the edge of the extraction zone, looking back at her with an expression that was not a smile and was not relief and was something that didn't have a simple name, she did not stop. She ran the last 30 meters without slowing. Hayes caught her when she reached him, not because she fell, but because he stepped forward and his arm came around her. And for 1 second, she allowed her weight to go somewhere other than her own body, and that second was everything. I told you I'd be here, she said. His grip tightened. Yeah, he said. You did. The aircraft was 40 seconds out, 6 people, a mountain, 9 hours and 40 minutes of a thing that should not have worked and did. The rotors came over the ridgeline, and the wind hit them, and nobody said anything because there was nothing left to say that the wind wasn't already saying for them. It was almost over. Almost. But in the military, almost is where the most important things happen. And there was still one conversation left that none of them had been able to have, yet the one happening right now at Forward Operating Base Kilo in a signals room, between a corporal who had sent a notification he wasn't ordered to send and a major who was sitting in front of a monitoring screen watching 2 signals converge on a single grid point. Simmons watched the signals merge. He sat with it for a long moment. Then very quietly, to no one in particular, he said, "Bring her home," and the helicopter came down. The helicopter lifted and Emily felt the mountain fall away beneath her. Not metaphorically. She felt it physically, the drop in her stomach as the aircraft climbed the shift in air pressure. The way the sound changed from the open acoustics of the mountainside to the contained roar of the cabin. She felt all of it with a clarity that was almost violent, the way your senses work when they've been running on emergency power for 10 hours and suddenly the emergency is, if not over, then at least suspended. She was sitting on the floor of the aircraft with her back against the bulkhead. Drum was beside her, Hayes was across from her. The flight medic, a young man named Reyes, who moved with the economy of someone who has been patching people together in moving aircraft long enough that the motion had become background noise, was already working on her arm. The arm had made its feelings about the last 3 hours very clear. "This is going to hurt," Reyes said. "It's already hurting," Emily said. "More than this," he said. He was right. She made a sound when he stabilized the fracture. a short, controlled sound that she released and then recaptured in the next breath. Drum's jaw tightened. He looked at the wall. She noticed that. She filed it away in the same place she filed everything that mattered about the people who had come for her, not to be thought about now, but to be thought about later when later was available. Reyes moved to her leg. His hands were quick and certain. The fracture shifted, he said not accusingly, just clinically. At some point during movement. At several points during movement, Emily said. Reyes looked up at her briefly, then back at her leg. How did you keep moving, he asked. One step at a time, she said. Literally. He said nothing more. He worked. The aircraft banked south. Hayes was watching her from across the cabin. He had not said anything since they lifted. He was doing what good operators do when an operation concludes and the debrief hasn't started yet. Running it back internally, tracking the decision points, logging the places where things had almost broken differently. Emily could read the process in his face because she ran the same one herself. It was the face of someone who is not yet in the after, who is still catching up to the fact that the during is over. She met his eyes across the cabin. He said, "You should sleep." "I'll sleep when we land," she said. "We're 40 minutes from Kilo." "Then I'll sleep in 40 minutes. He didn't push it. He understood why. The kind of alertness she was carrying wasn't something you could simply switch off at altitude. It had to wind down on its own schedule, and pushing against it was like trying to talk someone out of a physiological response. You couldn't. You just had to let it run. Pacheco from the forward section of the cabin said, without looking up from his equipment check, "For what it's worth, Carter, that diversion was a good call." "It worked," she said. "That's how we measure good calls," he said. Vega added from somewhere near the door, "The part where you ran the last 30 meters on a fractured leg was maybe a little excessive." 30 meters isn't running, Emily said. 30 meters is motivated walking. Something shifted in the cabin. Not laughter, the situation was too close behind them for laughter. But the thing that lives adjacent to laughter. The release valve that people who do this kind of work have developed for exactly these moments, because the alternative is sitting with the full weight of what just happened without any cushion, and nobody does that on the aircraft home. You save that for 0300 when you're alone and the mission report is written and there's nothing left to do but feel it. Hayes almost smiled. Almost. Mark aircraft 20 minutes to Kilo. His radio lit up on the command channel. He looked at the channel identifier. He looked at the encryption signature. He put the headset on. "Reaper lead, this is far. You are clear for approach to Kilo. Medical team is standing by." "Copy, sir. We have one casualty requiring immediate surgical evaluation. 5 additional personnel, no injuries." "Copy that." A pause. Hayes. "Sir, there will be a formal review of the mission deviation. You understand that?" "Yes, sir." "I need you to understand it completely. What you did tonight is not something the chain of command can simply acknowledge without process. There are orders that were given and not followed. That has to go through the system." "I understand, sir." "Good." Another pause, this one longer than the previous two. And then Farr said something that Hayes had not expected and would remember precisely for the rest of his career. "I also need you to understand that the formal review is going to take time, and that while it's ongoing, you and your team are restricted from operational deployment." A beat. "Which means you're going to be stateside for approximately 60 days minimum." Hayes processed this. "That's a consequence, sir," he said carefully. "It is," Farr said. "It's also the longest consecutive leave any of you have taken in 3 years. I'm told Pacheco's wife just had a baby." Hayes went very still. "Yes, sir," he said. 4 weeks ago." "Right," Farr said. "The review begins in 72 hours. In the meantime, get your people home." The channel closed. Hayes sat with the headset in his hands for a moment. Then he looked at Pacheco. Pacheco was looking back at him. "The review timeline," Hayes said. 60 days minimum." Pacheco's expression didn't change for a moment. Then something crossed it very briefly, very human. Very much the face of a man who has been away from a 4-week-old child for longer than he was supposed to be. 60 days stateside, Pacheco said, at minimum. Pacheco turned and looked at the bulkhead for a moment. His jaw worked. Then he looked back at Hayes. "I can live with that," he said. Emily had heard the exchange. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. What she felt was a specific and complicated kind of gratitude that had no clean expression, the knowledge that the people who had come for her were going to pay a cost, and that the cost was going to take something from them, and that they had known this was possible when they came anyway. That knowledge sat inside her chest and didn't resolve. She didn't expect it to resolve. Some things don't resolve. They just become part of the architecture. Drum beside her said quietly, "It was worth it." He said it the way young people say things when they are absolutely certain and haven't yet learned the reflexive self-doubt that experience sometimes teaches. He said it with the complete conviction of someone who has just done the most important thing they've done in their life and knows it with a clarity that has nothing complicated about it. Emily looked at him. "Yeah," she said, "it was." Mark Kilo wire landing. The aircraft touched down at forward operating base Kilo at 0612 local time. The medical team was waiting. They had Emily on a stretcher and moving toward the surgical bay within 90 seconds of the doors opening, which was efficient even by military medical standards. She didn't want the stretcher. She said so. The lead trauma surgeon, a woman named Captain Diana Walsh, who had been practicing military medicine for 8 years and had the particular bedside manner of someone who has heard every version of "I'm fine" from people who were not fine, looked at Emily's leg and said flatly, "You've been walking on this for approximately 10 hours. You've done enough walking. Get on the stretcher." Emily got on the stretcher. Hayes walked beside it for the first 30 meters until the medical team turned toward the surgical bay and the access was restricted. He stopped at the door. Emily turned her head and looked back at him. She said, "Hayes." He stopped. "I'm going to need to know their names," she said. "All of them, when this is done." He understood what she meant. Not for a report, not for an official acknowledgement, for herself, for the thing she was going to carry, which needed the names attached to it to be carried correctly. "You'll have them," he said. The door closed. Hayes stood at the door for 3 seconds. Then he turned around and walked back to his team, who were standing in a loose group in the way that people stand when the adrenaline has run out and there is nothing left to do, and the body doesn't yet know what the default state feels like. "Debrief in 2 hours," he said. "Before that food water, sit down somewhere. And sleep," Drum said, "if you can. 2 hours." Nobody moved for a moment. Then Pacheco said very quietly, "We got her." It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a statement that required a response. It was the verbal equivalent of the last piece of something settling into place, the final acknowledgement that the thing they had set out to do was done. Hayes looked at him. "We got her," he confirmed. Vega sat down on the ground right where he was standing. No ceremony. He just sat down, put his arms on his knees, and looked at the sky. Drum sat down next to him. Tong leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. Pacheco stood for another moment, then took out his phone, looked at the signal, and walked away from the group toward the perimeter, where the signal was probably better. Hayes watched him go. He watched the moment when Pacheco stopped walking, looked at the screen, and pressed call. He watched Pacheco's posture change when the call connected the specific softening that happens in a body when someone you love answers, when the voice you've been holding in a protected part of yourself for weeks comes through a speaker and is suddenly real and present and not lost. Hayes looked away. He found a wall. He sat down against it. He hadn't slept in 26 hours. He wasn't going to sleep in the next 2. He sat against the wall and ran the mission back one more time. Not the version where they almost didn't make the window. Not the version where the contact from behind could have gone differently. Not any of the versions where the outcome was not the outcome they had gotten. The actual version. The one that happened. He ran Adi back and looked at every decision point. He had made the right calls. He was as certain of that as he was capable of being certain of anything which was not absolutely certain. Because absolute certainty after the fact was a luxury that people in his position couldn't afford. You reviewed, you assessed, you acknowledged what could have been different, and then you put it down and you went forward, carrying the lesson, but not the weight. I was still working on putting it down when Major Simmons walked around the corner of the building and stopped in front of him. Hayes looked up. Simmons looked down. The silence between them had a texture to it. It was not hostile. It was not simple. It was the silence of 2 men who had both been in the same situation from opposite positions and both understood fully what the other had done and why. Simmons said, "She's in surgery." "I know," Hayes said. "Walsh says the leg is repairable. The arm will take longer." He paused. "She's going to be okay." "I know," Hayes said again. Simmons looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "You disobeyed a direct order." "Yes, sir." "You compromised the secondary mission timeline." "Yes, sir." "You put your team in a situation that could have gotten all of them killed." "Yes, sir." Simmons was quiet. "Then she had been broadcasting for 6 hours," he said. "It wasn't directed at Hayes, it was directed at the air in front of him, at whatever was standing in front of him that wasn't Hayes. I made a calculation, based on available assets mission, priority threat assessment. I made a calculation." "Yes, sir," Hayes said. He kept his voice even. He was not angry at Simmons in the way that anger required an outlet. He understood Simmons. He had made calls like Simmons's call before, not this particular call, not with this outcome, but calls of the same architecture. He knew what it felt like to look at the math and make the choice the math indicated. He also knew what it felt like to look at the math and decide the math was missing something. "The calculation was wrong," Simmons said. It was the hardest kind of sentence to say, the kind that costs something real to get out. "The calculation didn't account for the human variable," Hayes said, not accusatorially, just accurately. Simmons looked at him directly. Something in the Major's face had changed from what Hayes remembered of it in the brief interactions they'd had before this. There was a new quality there, the specific texture of a person who has updated something fundamental about how they see the world and is still in the early stages of living with the update. "No," Simmons said, "it didn't." He stood for a moment longer. Then he said, "The formal review is Colonel Farr's process. I won't interfere with it, but for what it's worth," he paused, "I filed a supplementary report at 0430 before you landed, detailing the signals intelligence that Corporal Trant developed in the complete operational picture as I understood it at the time of my initial decision." Hayes looked at him. "It's on the record," Simmons said, "the full picture, including what I did and didn't do with the information I had." There was something significant in that. Hayes understood it as an act of accountability, not self-destruction, not martyrdom, but the specific discipline of a person who has decided that their record will reflect the truth rather than the defensible version of the truth. That was not a small thing. It was in some ways harder than what Hayes had done because Hayes had disobeyed orders in real time with adrenaline and mission momentum carrying him forward. Simmons had walked into a record system in the quiet of 0430 and typed his own honest accounting. "Thank you, sir," Hayes said. Simmons nodded once. He walked away. "Mark Kylo Surgical Bay Hour. Hour 2 Emily came out of the initial surgery at 0847. The fracture in her arm required internal fixation hardware that would stay in her body permanently. A metal reminder of October 14th that would set off airport security scanners for the rest of her life. The leg was more complex. Walsh had called in a second surgeon for the leg. Between the two of them, they had worked for 2 hours and 15 minutes. Emily came out of the anesthesia in stages the way it usually goes. First, the awareness of being alive, then of being warm, then of the specific quality of ceiling tiles that exist only in military medical facilities, then of Walsh's face looking down at her. "Surgery went well," Walsh said. "You're going to need physical therapy, a significant amount of it." Emily blinked. "How long?" "Before you return to duty, minimum 4 months, possibly 6. Emily looked at the ceiling. "That's a long time," she said. "You walked on a fractured tibia for 10 hours, Walsh said. "There's a cost for that." Emily accepted this. Not easily, but she accepted, Walsh stepped back and there was someone else in the room. Corporal James Trant was standing near the door with the posture of someone who is not sure they're supposed to be there, but who has decided the risk of being told to leave is lower than the cost of not coming. He was in his mid-20s, dark eyes, the specific look of someone who has been awake for a very long time and is running on something that isn't caffeine so much as conscience. Emily looked at him. "You don't know me," he said. "No," she said. "I'm Trant. I'm in signals. I'm the one who," he stopped, reorganized. "When Major Simmons directed me to log your transmissions and continue monitoring, I also pushed a secondary notification to units in range. It's what Hayes' team picked up. I needed you to know that someone heard you. From the beginning, I heard you." Emily looked at him for a long moment. Trant looked like he might say more. He looked like he was carrying something that needed an exit and hadn't found one yet. "Trant," she said. He stopped. "Thank you," she said, "for not turning it off." Something in his face shifted. It was not relief exactly. It was the expression of a person who has been holding their breath for a long time and has finally been told it's okay to exhale. "You're welcome, ma'am," he said. He nodded once and left. Emily lay back against the pillow. She looked at the ceiling. She thought about Webb, about Okafor, about Reyes. She had been putting that off with the same discipline she brought to everything. Grieve when you're safe. She was safe now, or safe enough. Safe enough that the rule no longer applied. She let herself think about them. It was not a clean process. It was not a process that resolved in any way that was satisfying or complete. It was just the beginning of something that was going to take a long time. The first honest acknowledgement that 3 people who had been in that helicopter with her were not in this room, and that the fact of that was not something she could treat the way she treated a fractured bone, stabilize, manage, push through. It was something she was going to have to carry, fully and without management, for as long as it needed to be carried. She let herself start carrying it. Walsh came back in at 09:20 and found Emily awake, staring at the ceiling. "You should sleep," Walsh said. "People keep telling me that," Emily said, "because people keep being right." Walsh checked the chart. "Hayes has been asking about you." Emily looked at her. "He's outside," Walsh said. "Has been for the last hour." Emily thought about that. "Let him in," she said. Hayes came in quietly, the way he moved through everything with the minimum necessary displacement of air, a trained economy of presence that was not coldness, but its opposite, the specific consideration of a person who is always aware of the space they're taking up. He sat in the chair beside the bed. He looked at her. She looked at him. "6 months before I'm back," she said. "I heard. That's going to be a long 6 months." "Yeah," he said. Silence, not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that exists between people who have been through something together and don't need to fill the air to stay connected. Then Emily said, "Hayes, the formal review." "It's 60 days, he said, stateside." "I know." Farr briefed me. She paused. "I'm going to make a statement, for the record, a full account of the operational timeline, including the 6 hours I spent broadcasting with no response, and including what happened when Reaper team reached me." Hayes looked at her. "You don't need to do that." "I know I don't need to," she said. "I want to, because the record is incomplete without it, and because the people who should be credited need to be credited." She met his eyes, all of them. Hayes held her gaze. "You're going to make a lot of noise," he said. "I've been told that before," she said. Something finally broke loose in his face. Not a full smile. Something smaller and more genuine, the expression of a man who has just confirmed something he suspected about a person and finds the confirmation satisfying. "All right," he said. "Trant too," she said. "Whatever he did, it needs to be on the record as what it was." "What was it?" She thought about their question seriously, the way it deserved. "It was someone deciding that doing the right thing mattered more than doing the safe thing," she said. "In a signals room at 3 in the morning with nobody watching." "That's as pure as it gets," Hayes nodded slowly. They sat together in the quiet of the surgical bay for another few minutes. Outside the window, the base was beginning its morning activity, the sounds of an installation coming to life, engines and voices, and the specific ambient hum of a place that doesn't fully stop but does shift between registers of intensity. "Your team," Emily said. "Pacheco, his wife had a baby 4 weeks ago. He needs to go home." "He is going home," Hayes said. "All of them. 60 days. Emily nodded. She thought about Pacheco at the perimeter calling home. She thought about the voice on the other end of that call. "Good," she said. She closed her eyes then, not because the conversation was over. It wasn't, not really, not in the larger sense of everything that had been started on that mountain that was still unfinished, but because her body had been asking for exactly this: sleep, warmth, safety for 10 hours. And she had been refusing it for 10 hours, and the refusal had served its purpose, and the purpose was over. The last thing she was aware of before the sleep took her was Hayes still in the chair beside her, not leaving, not saying anything, just there. Just there. It was enough. It was, in fact, exactly enough. And across the base in a signals room, Corporal James Trant finally closed the monitoring screen, logged his last entry for the night, put on his jacket, and walked out into the morning. "I didn't look like a hero. He didn't walk like a hero. He walked like a 22-year-old who needed breakfast and 8 hours and the particular kind of quiet that comes after you've done something that mattered and you haven't yet figured out what it means." He walked toward the mess hall. He thought about the voice on the radio, This is Echo 2-1, still alive. He thought about those three words for a long time. Still alive. Two words would have been enough, but she had said three. And the third one, alive, was not just a status report. It was a statement of intention. A declaration, something she was saying, not just to whoever was listening, but to the mountain and the cold and the broken arm and the fractured leg and the 10 hours of static that had answered her with nothing. Still alive. He understood, walking toward the mess hall in the early morning of a base in a war, that some people carry that sentence with them forever. That they said it once under impossible circumstances, and it became the sentence they live by, the thing they return to when everything else gets complicated and the math doesn't work and the calculation says to give up. Still alive. He thought about that. And somewhere in a surgical bay, Emily Carter slept. She woke up on the third morning and cried for the first time. Not because of the pain, though. The pain was real and constant and had a particular quality in the early morning hours when the medication was at its lowest point and her body was most honest about the damage it had taken. Not because of the arm, which was held together now by titanium hardware, that Walsh had described in clinical terms, that Emily had listened to with the specific half attention of someone who already understood the bottom line and didn't need the technical details. Not because of the leg, which was going to require 4 months minimum of physical therapy, and which she had already begun arguing about in terms of timeline with every medical professional who came within arguing distance. She cried because of Webb and Okafor and Reyes. She had been putting it off with everything she had. She had put it off through the crash and the 7 hours alone on the mountain and the extraction and the surgery and the first 2 days of recovery, which had been full enough visitors, medical assessments, the beginning of the formal debrief process. Hayes in the chair beside her bed more often than anyone had officially authorized that she had been able to keep the grief in the compartment she had built for it and tell herself she was simply being disciplined rather than avoidant. On the third morning, the compartment opened. She was alone. It was Euro 4:30. The ward was quiet in the specific way military medical wards are quiet at that hour, not silent, never silent, but quiet in a way that has space in it. Space that the daytime fills with activity and noise and purpose, and that the pre-dawn hours return to you whether you want it or not. She thought about Marcus Webb. She thought about the way he laughed too loud, always slightly too loud for whatever room he was in. The laugh of a man who thought life was genuinely funny and wanted everyone in the vicinity to know it. She thought about the fact that she would never hear that laugh again, and that the world was smaller for it in a way that couldn't be measured but could absolutely be felt. She thought about David Okafor, who had been 24 years old and had a sister in Atlanta who had called him every Sunday without exception, and who had shown Emily photographs of that sister on his phone once in a waiting room between briefings, not because she had asked, but because he was proud of her and couldn't always help showing it. She thought about Tommy Reyes, 26, 2 years with the unit, the quietest of the three, and she had always believed the one paying the most attention, the one who noticed things. She cried for all three of them. She cried for 8 minutes by the clock on the wall, which she watched, because watching the clock was the only way she had of giving the grief a boundary of saying, I will feel this fully and I will not stop it, and I will also not lose myself in it. 8 minutes, full and complete and honest. And then she wiped her face with the back of her good hand, and she breathed slowly and deliberately until the breathing was regular. Then she pressed the call button on. The night nurse appeared, specialist Karen Morales, who had the specific quality of night shift medical personnel, unhurried, observant, the kind of steady that only develops when you've seen enough of the 0430 version of people to stop being surprised by it. Can I get water? Emily said. Morales looked at her face, understood what the face meant. She got the water. She also pulled up the chair beside the bed and sat in it without being asked and without saying anything unnecessary. She just sat there while Emily drank the water, present, in the particular way that presence matters most when it asks nothing in return. Thank you, Emily said when she was done. That's what I'm here for, Morales said. Emily looked at her. I meant for sitting down. Morales held her gaze. I know what you meant, she said. She stayed for 11 more minutes. Then she went back to her rounds. Emily lay in the dark and thought about the word still. Still alive. She had set it into a broken radio in the dark on a mountain, and it had traveled 30 miles through static and degraded signal to a monitoring station where a 22-year-old corporal had heard it and had made a decision. And that decision had traveled to a mountainside where a five-man team had made a different decision. And those decisions together had brought her here to this bed, to this morning, to these 8 minutes of grief that she owed 3 people and had finally paid. Still, it was such a small word for everything it was carrying. Mark day 5. The formal debrief began on day 5 of her recovery. Colonel Farr conducted it personally. He came to the surgical ward because Walsh had been categorical about Emily not being moved for transport to the operations center, a position Emily had argued against and Farr had ultimately supported because Emily was learning a man who picked his battles with a precision that was either extremely calculated or extremely wise, and probably both. He sat across from her with a recorder and a legal pad and the specific expression of a senior officer who has been doing this long enough to understand that the person across from him is not a subject to be processed but a source of information that deserves to be heard completely. "I'm going to ask you to take me through the entire timeline," he said, "beginning to end. Your words, your pace. I'll ask questions when I need clarification." Emily nodded. "One thing before we start," Farr said. He set down his pen. "I have read Sergeant Hayes's full operational account. I have read Corporal Trant's signals log. I have read Major Simmons's supplementary report." He looked at her directly. "I am aware of the complete picture. What I need from you is not a reconstruction of the facts as they appear in those documents. What I need is your experience. What you understood, what you decided, and why." Emily looked at him for a moment. "That's a different kind of debrief," she said. "Yes," he said. "Then, it is." She told him everything. She told him from the beginning the 3-minute ritual that had stretched to 4 the quality of the morning, that her body had registered before her mind had the language for it. She told him about the crash and the assessment and the rule about grieving when you're safe. She told him about the 17 radio transmissions before the first response. She told him about the 2 patrols that passed within 40 meters and the second one that passed within 15. She told him about counting steps. She told him about falling twice. Farr listened. He did not interrupt. He wrote, but not constantly, selectively, with the economy of a man who has learned that the most important things are rarely the ones you expect going in. When she reached the extraction, he held up a hand. "One moment," he said, "the decision to create the diversion element, separating yourself from the main body with drum. Walk me through that." Emily walked him through it. Farr was quiet for a moment after. "Hayes agreed to this," he said. "He modified it," she said. "Drum instead of Pacheco. The strategic logic was mine. The personnel decision was his. Did you expect him to agree?" She thought about the question seriously. "No," she said. "I expected him to argue. I had my argument ready." She paused. "He surprised me." "How?" "He ran the math faster than I expected him to," she said. "And he trusted my terrain assessment without verifying it independently. Given that we had known each other for approximately 3 hours at that point, that was..." She stopped. "That was significant." Farr made a note. "It worked," Emily said. "It worked," Farr agreed. He looked at his pad. He looked at her. "I have one more question," he said, "and it is not part of the formal debrief. You can decline to answer it." "Ask it," she said. "In the 6 hours before Reaper team made contact when you were broadcasting into static with no response, did you believe someone was coming?" The room was very quiet. Emily thought about the question the way it deserved to be thought about. Not the fast answer, not the answer that sounded right, but the true one. "No," she said. "I didn't believe it. Not with any confidence." She paused. "But I kept transmitting anyway, because silence felt like the only thing that could actually beat me. And I wasn't willing to let silence win." Farr looked at her for a long moment. He wrote something on the pad. He didn't show her what it was. "Mark day 8, twist 1. On day 8, Major Gerald Simmons came to see her. She had been expecting this. She had thought about what she would say, and she had discarded 3 versions of the conversation before she arrived at the one that felt honest. She was not angry at Simmons the way anger required a clear target. The situation was more complex than that, and she was a person who respected complexity enough not to flatten it into something easier to feel. He came in the morning. He stood at the door of the room until she looked at him, and then he came in and he sat down without waiting to be invited, which she took as a sign that he had also thought about this and had decided that waiting to be invited was not the right register for what he needed to say. I made a decision on October 14th, he said without preamble. I know, she said, based on threat assessment, asset availability, and mission priority. I know. He looked at his hands. They were folded in his lap in the way hands fold when they are being kept deliberately still. I filed the supplementary report, he said. On the record, full accounting. I know that too, she said. Farr mentioned it. I'm not telling you because I want credit for it, he said quickly. The quickness was telling. It was the speed of a man who is worried about being misread and needs to correct the misreading before it sets. I'm telling you because I need you to understand that I understand what the decision cost. Emily looked at him. It cost Webb, she said, and Okafor and Reyes. The room went very quiet. Their deaths were from the crash, Simmons said. His voice was careful. That wasn't my... I know, she said. She was not letting him off the hook. She was being precise. The crash killed them. Your decision to not respond to my transmissions was a separate cost. What it cost was 6 hours of me alone on a mountain that didn't need to be 6 hours. She held his eyes. I'm not saying you're responsible for the crash. I'm saying I'm responsible for knowing the difference. Simmons processed that. That's a precise way of thinking about it, he said. I'm a precise person, she said. He nodded. Then he said something she had not expected. I have a daughter, he said. She's 24. She's in the Air Force, flight crew. He looked at the wall for a moment. I thought about that. At 4:30 when I was writing the supplementary report, I thought about if it were her on that mountain. Emily said nothing. I know that's not the right way to think about it, Simmons said. The right way is to think about every person in that situation the same way regardless of personal connection. That's the standard. That's what we're supposed to do. Yes, Emily said, but it's also the thing that made me pick up the pen at 4:30, he said, so I'm not sure how wrong it is. Emily looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Webb's laugh, about Okafor's sister in Atlanta, about Tommy Reyes, the quiet one, the one who noticed things. She thought about what it means to make decisions about human lives through the lens of strategic mathematics and about what it costs when the mathematics is correct and the answer is still wrong. Simmons, she said. He looked at her. The standard you described, thinking about every person, the same way that's not a failure of the standard that you didn't meet it in this case. She paused. That's a failure of the standard that we collectively built a system where meeting it is hard enough that people like you have to think about their daughters at 4:30 to find it. She let that sit. That's not on you. That's on all of us. Simmons stared at her. For a moment, something crossed his face that was very far from the expression of a major with 15 years and 3 combat deployments. It was something much more foundational than rank. It was the face of a person who has just been told something true in a way that reorganizes how they carry it. How are you not angrier at me? He said. I am angry, she said simply. I just know that anger aimed at you specifically isn't the point. He nodded slowly. He stood up to leave. At the door, he stopped and turned back. He looked at her with the specific expression of someone about to say something they have been deciding whether to say for the entire length of the conversation. For what it's worth, he said, when I watched the signals converge on Trant's screen, when I watched Hayes' team closing the distance to your grid, I told you to come home. I know, she said. Walsh told me. He looked surprised. Trant told Walsh, she said. Walsh told me. The corners of his expression shifted. Not quite a smile. Something quieter than that. Get better, Carter, he said. Yes, sir, she said. Mark day 14. Twist 2. The review board concluded on day 14. Emily submitted her formal statement on day 10. She had written it herself in longhand with her right hand because her left was still immobilized 4 pages that covered the complete operational timeline from her perspective and included specific commendation requests for Hayes, Pacheco, Vega, Tungdrum, and Trant. She had been particular about Trant. She had written, Corporal James Trant acted within the technical boundaries of his authorized duties while simultaneously exercising a moral judgment that exceeded what those duties required. In doing so, he created the only path by which contact with a survivor unit became possible. His action was not dramatic. It was a single decision made in a signals room at approximately 0300 with no guarantee of outcome and no expectation of recognition. It was by any meaningful measure the action that started everything else. The record should reflect that. The board took 4 days. The outcome was announced on day 14, and Hayes was the first person she heard it from, not officially, but because he came to the ward before the official notification reached her and sat down in the chair and told her directly. Review board concluded this morning, he said, and she said, team conduct was reviewed and assessed as, he paused in a way that told her he was quoting, consistent with the core values of the United States Marine Corps, exercising initiative and moral judgment in the preservation of human life under conditions where established protocols proved insufficient. Emily was quiet for a moment. That's formal language for not court-martialing you, she said. That is correct, Hayes said. The 60-day stateside restriction stands. Modified, he said, 45 days, with the remaining 15 converted to a leadership training assignment. He paused. At Quantico. Quantico, Emily repeated. Farr's decision. He wants the case reviewed as a training example. Hayes said it without obvious emotion, but she heard the thing underneath it, the particular quality of a person who has been asked to let their hardest experience become a lesson for other people and is working out how they feel about that. How do you feel about that? She asked. I feel like if it means one more team doesn't leave one more person on a mountain, he said, then it was worth having. She looked at him. Trant, she said. Hayes almost smiled. Commendation formal, for he consulted nothing because he had memorized this for exercising initiative in the critical communication of life-threatening operational intelligence beyond the scope of direct authorization, resulting in the preservation of a service member's life. Emily exhaled. Good, she said. There's one more thing, Hayes said. His voice had changed, slightly. The change was subtle enough that someone who hadn't spent time listening closely to how he spoke would have missed it. She had been listening closely to how he spoke for 14 days. Tell me, she said. The formal review included a secondary assessment of the protocols governing combat survivor response in high-threat environments, he said, specifically the Decision Authority Framework for Emergency Extraction Requests in Contested Sectors. She sat up slightly. Her arm protested. She ignored it. They're changing the protocol, she said. It wasn't a question. They're reviewing it, Hayes said, which in military bureaucracy terms means, it's changing, she said. He nodded. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than any they had shared before. It was the silence of something that has been started, not finished, not resolved, but genuinely started in a way that changes what comes after. Emily thought about Webb and Okafor and Reyes. She thought about whether the protocol change would have made a difference on October 14th, and she arrived honestly at maybe. Probably not for the crew of Echo 2-1 whose deaths had nothing to do with the protocol. But for the 6 hours she had spent broadcasting into static. For the next person who ended up on a mountain with a broken radio and a narrowing window. Maybe was not enough. But it was more than nothing. Okay, she said. Mark day 30 the visit. They came on a Thursday, all 5 of them. Hayes had coordinated it without telling her in advance, which she suspected was deliberate, not because he thought she needed to be surprised, but because he understood that she was the kind of person who, given advance notice of something emotionally significant, would spend the intervening time managing her reaction to it rather than simply having it. She heard them before she saw them. The particular sound of a group of people trying to move quietly through a hospital ward and not entirely succeeding, the self-consciousness of it, the way Drum's boot caught on the door threshold, and he said something under his breath that she suspected was not suitable for a medical facility. Then they were in the room. Pacheco came in first. He looked different from the mountain, not in his physicality, which was exactly as it had been, but in something around his face, a looseness that had been absent in the operational context and was now present in the way people look when they have been home long enough to stop being operationally ready and start being a person again. You look like you slept, she said. 12 days of it, he said. My daughter thinks I'm furniture. She laughed. A real one, the kind that surprised her with his completeness. Vega came in behind Pacheco with the easy, unhurried quality he seemed to bring to everything. He looked at her arm and her leg and made a brief assessing expression. Walsh says 6 months, he said. Walsh is conservative, Emily said. Walsh is a surgeon, Vega said. Being conservative is literally her job description. Tung came in next, and then Drum, and then the room had a different quality. 5 people in Emily and the specific weight of what they had all been through together that was present in the room without being spoken. The way significant things are often present in rooms without being spoken. Drum was the youngest and the most visibly affected by being there. He stood near the door for a moment before he came fully in, and when he did, he looked at Emily with the direct, slightly uncertain honesty of someone who has been thinking about this moment for 2 weeks and still isn't sure what the right words are. "I have been thinking about what to say," he said. "I can tell," she said, not unkindly. "I don't have anything," he said. "I rehearsed 4 different things and none of them were right." "Then don't say any of them," she said. He nodded. He pulled up a chair. He sat down. That was enough. Hayes came in last after all of them were settled. He sat in the chair that had over the past 2 weeks effectively become his chair. The one beside her bed, slightly angled toward her, the one that Morales had stopped moving back to the wall after day 3 because she could see that it was going to be moved back again within the hour. They sat together for a while, all 6 of them, in the specific ease of people who have been through something together and discovered that the thing has made them capable of sitting in the same room without needing to fill it. It was Pacheco who eventually said, "My wife wants to meet you." Emily looked at him. "She says anyone who made that run on a fractured leg deserves to come to dinner," he said. "I walked," Emily said. "Motivated walking." "Drum told her you ran." Drum, to his credit, said nothing. He appeared to be studying the ceiling with great interest. "Tell her I'll come to dinner when I'm mobile," Emily said. "She'll hold you to that," Pacheco said. "I know," Emily said. "Tell her I'm counting on it." Mark day 45, the question. It was late afternoon when she finally asked the question she had been building toward for 45 days. She had been constructing it carefully, not strategically, not the way you construct a question when you're trying to get a specific answer, but carefully in the way of someone who wants to ask something real and needs the words to be precise enough to carry the real thing without distortion. Hayes was in the chair. He had been reading, which he occasionally did when he visited, and she was sleeping or resting. He had a book that he kept in the breast pocket of his jacket and took out without ceremony when the room was quiet and Emily had never asked him what it was, because it seemed like something he kept for himself and she respected that. He put the book away when she opened her eyes. "Hayes," she said. "Yeah." "When you heard my transmission for the first time, Tung playing it on the receiver in the field, what did you think?" He looked at her carefully. "I think I asked Tong how far," he said. "That's what you did," she said. "What did you think?" I was quiet for a moment. The silence had the quality of someone searching for something honest. "I thought it sounded like someone who was going to keep going as long as they had air," he said. "And I thought that person deserved someone going toward them." Emily held his gaze. "And when you heard the order to continue the primary mission," she said. "When command said don't respond, what did you think then?" Hayes looked at his hands. He turned the thought over once. "I thought about a hillside in Helmand province," he said, 8 years ago, when it was me on the radio and it was somebody else deciding whether to come." Emily was quiet. She had not known this. In 45 days and more conversations than she could count, he had not mentioned it. "Someone came," she said. "It was not a question." "Someone came," he confirmed, "and you decided to pay it forward." He looked at her. Something in his expression was very still. "I decided I wasn't going to be the person who heard the radio and didn't answer," he said. "That's all it was. It wasn't complicated." Emily thought about that. "It's the least complicated thing in the world," she said. "Answering is simple. It's the system around the answering that gets complicated." "Yeah," he said. She breathed in and out once. "Thank you," she said. "I know I've said it. I'm saying it again." "You can stop saying it," he said. "I'm going to keep saying it until I find the version of it that's the right size," she said. "And I don't think I found it yet." He looked at her for a long moment. "You don't owe me a thank you, that's the right size," he said. "You owe yourself a recovery, that's the right length. Those are different debts." She thought about that for a moment. Then she said very quietly, "I'm going to go back." He didn't look surprised. "I know," he said. "Walsh says 6 months." "I know. I think 4, she said. "See, Walsh thinks you'll think that," he said. "Walsh is probably right," Emily admitted, "but I'm going to try for 4 anyway." Hayes said nothing, but the thing that happened in his expression was not disagreement. It was recognition. The specific recognition of someone who sees themselves in another person's stubbornness and can't honestly argue against it because they would do exactly the same thing. "When you go back," he said, "you're going to be different." "I know." "Not worse," he said quickly. "Different. The people who've been where you've been, they see things differently. What matters and what doesn't. Who deserves what and why? It changes your operational judgment. Does it change yours? She said. He thought about Helmand Province, about 8 years, about the 17 decisions between that hillside and this chair. Every day, he said. Emily nodded. She lay back against the pillow and looked at the ceiling. She thought about Webb and Okafor and Reyes. She thought about them with the specific quality that grief takes on when it has been honestly felt and honestly carried, not lighter exactly, but more portable. Something you can set down for a moment and pick back up and carry further. She thought about them and about the protocol review and about the dinner at Pacheco's house that she was going to attend when she was mobile. She thought about Trant in the mess hall at 0630 after 26 hours awake, thinking about the words still alive. She thought about what it means to build a system, a unit, a team, a military, a country, on the idea that the person beside you is worth what it costs to go back for them. She thought about how that idea was not complicated when it was true and how hard it was to keep it true when the mathematics got complicated and the assets were limited and the threat assessment was extremely high, and a major with 15 years made a calculation that the calculation said was correct. She thought about Simmons at 0430 picking up the pen. She thought about what it had cost him to do that. Not his career. The career had survived, probably would continue. She meant the other cost, the one that doesn't show up in records or reviews. The private cost of sitting alone in the early hours with a pen in your hand and the honest accounting of a decision that was rational and wrong and choosing to write the truth of it down anyway. That was not a small thing. She thought about all of them, every one of them, the whole chain of it from the crash to this room, every person who had made a decision in the direction of her life rather than away from it. Trant sending the notification, Hayes calling his team together, Pacheco saying we might as well take the southern road. Drum sitting down next to Vega without saying the words he'd rehearsed. Morales pulling up the chair at 0430. Farr saying good work on a secured channel over the roar of a helicopter. Simmons picking up the pen, every link in the chain, every person who had said yes, in whatever form yes took in their specific moment to the idea that her life was worth the cost of saying it. She thought about that chain for a long time, and then she thought about the chain going forward, about going back, about the next mission and the next team and the next person who might end up on a mountain in the dark with a broken radio and a narrowing window. She thought of what she was going to carry back with her when she went. Not just the lesson, not just the experience. The specific knowledge that the chain is real, that it works, that it is made of ordinary people making non-ordinary decisions in signals rooms and on mountainsides and in hallways outside surgical bays, and that every link matters and that no link is too small to be the one that holds. She was going to carry that back. She was going to teach it. Hayes, she said. He had been quiet for a long time. She suspected he had been doing his own version of the same accounting. Yeah, he said, when you go back, and I know the review is over and the 45 days are almost done, and you're going to go back, yeah, he said. When the next thing happens, she said, when the next person is on the radio, when the math says it's too dangerous and the assets are committed and the order comes down to continue the primary mission. She met his eyes. Answer the radio. Hayes looked at her. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the drainage channel while the aircraft were overhead, with the full and complete attention of a person who is hearing something that matters and wants to receive it correctly. I will, he said. Every time, she said. Every time, he agreed. And that was the promise. Not the grand kind. Not the kind with ceremony and witnesses and formal language. The kind made between two people who have been through a thing together and understand in the full and undiminished truth of it what the thing costs and what it means. Emily Carter was going back to service. She would be different. Hayes had said so, and Hayes was right. She would carry Webb and Okafor and Reyes with her in the way you carry people you've lost who deserve to be carried, not as weight, not as guilt, but as the truest version of the reason for everything. She would carry Trant's decision and Simmons's pen and Pacheco's southern route and Drum's chair and Hayes's voice on a broken radio in the dark. She would carry the chain, and she would be for everyone who came after her another link in it, because that is what the promise means when it lives on past the moment it was made. It doesn't live in medals or reports or formal reviews. It lives in the person who received it and survived it and went back out and made it again, in whatever form the next moment required. It lives in the radio call that someone answers. It lives in the team that moves south when the order says north. It lives in the corporal who stays at his screen at Yo 300 and sends one more notification because silence feels like the wrong answer. It lives in every person who decides in their one specific moment that the human being on the other end of the frequency is worth the cost of answering. That is where it lives. That is where it always lives. And as long as there are people willing to answer, it